Just some thoughts about control. Control does not equal freedom or liberation. For myself, through my own journey of witnessing my own need to control other people or control myself or my habits, it's made it easier for me to see the control in others. So it's not that I'm above or beyond this. It's still layers that I'm working through myself. But I've often talked about, say, vegetarianism or veganism, and the way people can try to control their diets. So to simplify it, I would see it as the two types of vegans. There are people who wake up some morning and they just don't feel like eating meat anymore, or gradually they feel maybe it makes them sluggish or doesn't agree with them. That's a harmonious transition. Then there are other people who intellectually, say, worry about the processing of meat, which is understandable, or harm to animals and so on. So they intellectually cut out and deny their body eating meat. So that's control. That's the separation. It's not a harmonious. So their body may be crying out for protein or just crying out for meat, for that vibration that I still eat meat myself and I'm still working with the vibration of meat. And that would include all that you could encompass in the vibration of meat. I'm not complete with it, so maybe I never will be, or maybe it's far away, I don't know. Often when I would point out control to people I work with, initially they would be very defensive and unaware and really think, no, I don't control other people, or I don't control my life. I'm quite a free spirit, I'm flowing. And then would point out their behaviours or their thinking. They would begin to see the penny drops, that it's subtle. So for example, you would see, say, hippies or plenty of the spirituality world that would be, say, for free, no regulation of cannabis or of the rolling back, in a sense, of government laws. And these people might see themselves as being very free and they really want liberty. But then in other areas they might be saying, but we really have to control the water companies or the banks or the whatever. So that's quite an obvious that the ego finds a way to compartmentalize and to it's like in shadow work. It will find a pocket to place all that impatience or that rage or that whatever. So we can be going to our yoga class or a meditation group and we can be talking all the lovely spiritual stuff, and maybe we are peaceful people, and as I've said many times before, Donald Trump comes on the television and that shadow now is activated. I can't remember now who it was, who said, if you think you're enlightened, go spend time with your family. That's what I'm aiming for, is that liberation and freedom to be around any of these people or situations or politicians or whoever, and to be free, to not be activated and triggered, and to not have to cut these situations or people out of my life because they trigger me. Control is basically the ego's method or way of trying to feel at peace. It's controlling life, controlling situations. If I don't watch the news, if I don't watch Donald Trump, if I don't eat meat, if I stay away from meat eaters, if I stay away from cars because they're polluting the planet, if the world gets smaller and smaller because we end up cutting all of these things. I can't be around smokers because it's just so toxic and they're disgusting. I can't be around drinkers because it's violent, and I can't be around whatever. And we just gradually remove people. It's the ego's way of trying to convince ourselves that we are in control or that we are peaceful. But the world gets smaller. Now, on a grander scale, we see that really in politics, which is all community or society is just a reflection of ourselves. It's not separate from us. So we're seeing the shadow of humanity being presented. The rape gangs and paedophile gangs, I'm not sure how many are aware. I follow this fairly closely because it really interests me. It's being presented. A lot of Asian and Muslim gangs specifically, but there are white people and Jewish groups and all the rest that are involved in paedophile circles. Generally in the UK, this is coming up more and more. And I'm talking hundreds of generally men involved, but there are women involved as well. Hundreds, in some cases up to around 1,000 people in areas such as Rotherham or wherever else. This is society's shadow that is, in the past we have controlled and we have kept contained, around the time of, for those who know, of Jimmy Savile or Margaret Thatcher. The police were involved in a lot of this, and there were a lot of cover-ups. The files would just go missing, thousands of pages would just disappear just by chance, because there were Freemasons and there were politicians and there were royals and all the rest of it were involved in this, so it was controlled. But now we're in a time that this is breaking down and the shadow is being presented. So it's up to us, as I've said many times and as my work is, to honour our own shadow, to witness it. So I witness whatever is presented. I don't go looking, I don't watch the news, but some of this is presented to me. It finds me, and I'm okay with reading it. Some of the stuff, because it's relevant to where I work and the frequency that I work with, what I'm clearing from myself, which emanates out in the planet. But the day-to-day, Donald Trump, Obama, Hillary Clinton, sacrificing babies, I don't really get into that. It's all, a lot of that is just distraction. In short, what control we're seeing is society is expressed through, and our own controls are expressed through the government. So even though we complain about them, when it boils down to it, we have an opinion, and we might like somebody in power, or we got to have some restrictions on the banks. And we have to have some restrictions on we can't just have people walking around buying drugs on the street and buying guns and all the rest of it. And the media obviously has a slant to present to us. Whereas if you look into any of these subjects and you do enough research, we'll find that, for example, I was talking to someone yesterday about the strength of THC in cannabis. The reason cannabis has become more and more strong and destructive, and the shadow is now there's a lot of psychosis around cannabis. The reason a lot of this has presented itself is that, like what was called bathtub gin back in the times of prohibition in the US, that when you ban anything, it doesn't go away, it just goes underground and it actually becomes stronger. The gins and whiskies just became, very high percentages of alcohol, very destructive. People were getting drunk very quickly, violent. It was just unmanageable. Whereas to be able to go out and mix your drinks or drink freely or drink beer or drink low alcohol beer was people are going to use it. So cocaine, cannabis, heroin, all these things were legal 100 years ago. And you could buy them, in a pharmacy or over the counter or wherever. And the reasons a lot of them were banned were the likes of Coca-Cola. Religious groups wanted control. Coca-Cola, for example, obviously wanted to sell Coca-Cola. They wanted to sell their own products. They didn't want people drinking alcohol. And then the Christian groups and all the rest of it obviously wanted to control society as well. Then there was a racial element, because if I remember correctly, it was blacks who generally around California and parts of the States were smoking cannabis. So you had the white groups who didn't want the blacks, so it was a way to imprison black people. And then you had Mexicans and you had other ethnicities who were using, like the jazz clubs were using cocaine and using cannabis or using grass. So there was a lot of racial elements to try and a reason to imprison people and to shut down these clubs. Again, it was more control. So a lot of people were generally just using, it doesn't mean immediately that someone using cocaine or using heroin is immediately an addict. The use of opium and so on has been around for hundreds of years. Now, I'm not saying these are healthy things to use personally. I don't use them. And personally, I think that we're now at a time that we're working on a higher frequency than we have done hundreds of years ago. So I think it's wiser to move away from these things and to raise our frequency and perhaps work in ways that are a higher frequency rather than, the lower frequency stuff like heroin or alcohol is very destructive or very lower frequency. So some of us are meditating and doing yoga and maybe doing medicine work, and then we go drinking, or then we sit in front of the TV and we smoke loads of grass. And that's the shadow that's bringing us down again. We're trying to get up and then we're going down. But personally, and the result of the reason my website is called Spontaneous Evolution is that we have to evolve through these things. So the control of government, for example, in restricting drugs, or when they did restrict alcohol, or restricting trade, because we all need a license to trade. My basic, very simplistic idea is if I'm walking down the street and I'm wearing painter's clothes and a person comes up and says, "Hey, can you paint my door?" And I say, "Yeah, I'll paint it for €100. They say, "Okay, brilliant. I'll paint it tomorrow. Thank you. See you tomorrow." But the government will now come in and say, "Well, I need 25% of that." And my mind will go, "Why?" I just met this man on the street and he wants me to paint his door. And we obliged and we've come to a voluntary agreement, a transaction. But you want 25% of the money that I would earn for this. So that's a simplistic way of putting it. But we restrict and control everything. Everything is licensed, controlled, restricted. And it's the shadow of humankind. We're all trying to fucking control each other. We all think we know best. For the slave shops, for the poor people. Oh, we know if we could just do this for them. Without allowing them to have their own evolution and their own journey. If they ask for help, I'm more than willing to get involved and see, well, do I have any skills or tools that could be of use to you? Rather than from a distance, we'll try and get the government to fly in there or to go into that poor neighbourhood and organise it, clean that up while I sit on my couch watching Love Island or X Factor or whatever the fuck it is. So it's the armchair controller, So we have to evolve through all of this. We have to evolve. Like, I'm an alcoholic. I'm sober 18, 19 years. I don't want alcohol banned or removed because that ism within me, that restlessness, that dis-ease within me would just find another outlet. So we need to evolve, we need to grow beyond these things. And government, or the control or regulation of society and of each other, is another stage of evolution. We're moving beyond, it's breaking down. And that's why we're seeing in the last 2-3 decades that pretty much anyone now who's elected, they're only elected. And they're elected like 51-49%. There's no real majority. And then you've an awful lot of people who don't vote and who don't get involved, quite rightly so, I would say, who don't want anything to do with it. They're just peaceful people who'd like to get on with their lives. They don't need to be herded like sheep. And they don't want their overlord to herd other people, which is quite respectful in my mind. So we're moving beyond that. But at the same time as it's broken down, they're really cracking the whip and trying to get us involved in politics, to teach politics in schools in Ireland. That's a new thing coming in, to try and get young people engaged in controlling other people. Isn't that wonderful? It's the ego that's trying to feel peace, and the ego equates that with control. We see it often in relationships, the wife trying to control the husband, or the husband trying to control the wife, and they're both complementing each other, they're both doing it in certain ways. Then they're all controlling the kids, of what the kids do or don't do. There's a certain amount of freedom allowed, and people will say, "Oh, I'm not really like that." There are layers that we're as yet unaware of that we do control, and often it's painted as the well-intentioned, the well-intentioned idiot. It's like politicians, or it's like, we go into foreign countries to build schools and we're well-intentioned. I'm not controlling them. I'm just building a school. We just assume that we know what's best for other people. Again, it's the control. we think we'll feel better if we're doing these things to, we think, help other people. And often it's our own projection. It's just within ourselves. If we can just sit back and make peace with ourselves, we emanate a higher frequency, and in turn we're helping other people. We're raising the frequency of other people without having to stick our oar in and make them different and live the way we think is best. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually just sit down and speak to the homeless person rather than berating the politicians and demanding the politicians provide a home for them or a food for them? Imagine sitting down with them and saying, how are you doing? Do you want a cup of coffee? Or bringing them a cooked meal, or just listening to them and hearing why they're on the streets. Maybe they're an addict, maybe they were kicked out, maybe they've a disease, who knows? But just being present. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. There's a few links below for my newsletter, Insight Timer, and Instagram and so on. They may be of use, and please, if this was beneficial to you or helpful to you, please share it with others. And also, I have added thanks to a couple of people, such as Pavel. Thank you for that wonderful donation. There is a button below as well for PayPal. So anyone who listens to my videos regularly or reads my articles and so on, I'm going to find a way that you can donate anonymously. I'll have no idea who you are, and you can send €1 or €5 for a cup of coffee or whatever it is, if you feel moved. Thanks for listening. Share and be well.